Nowadays, we often hear about plane crashes, but today we are going to tell you a story about a crash that will send chills down your spine. This is the story of Flight 571, which crashed on a snowy mountain thousands of feet above the ground. The surviving passengers had only one way to save themselves: by eating the flesh of their own family members and friends. You can call the story of Flight 571 either the greatest miracle or the cruelest event in human history. This harrowing tale begins on October 12, 1972, when a chartered plane took off from Uruguay in South America, bound for Santiago, the capital of Chile. On board were rugby players, their families, relatives, and friends, 45 passengers in total. The flight wasn't supposed to be long. Typically, it takes just 3 hours to travel from Uruguay to Santiago. However, the Andes Mountains stood in their way, the world's longest mountain range, and after the Himalayas, the second highest in elevation. Unfortunately, these beautiful mountains would soon become a dreadful obstacle for the passengers. After flying safely for 2 hours, the plane encountered bad weather, forcing it to land in the city of Mendoza, Argentina. The plane stayed there overnight, and the next day, on October 13th, it was ready to take off again. Although the weather was still bad, the pilot, who had flown this route 29 times before, was confident in his ability to navigate the Andes. At 2:18 p.m., the plane took off again, with only an hour left to reach Santiago. Flying at an altitude of 18,000 feet, it slowly began to cross the Andes. But as the weather worsened, visibility decreased, and the pilot could no longer see anything ahead. Normally, pilots rely on the surrounding mountains to gauge their location, but in this case, the pilot had to depend entirely on the plane's instruments. Thinking they had crossed the mountains, the pilot requested permission to land at Santiago Airport. The air traffic controller, ATC, asked if they had indeed crossed the Andes, and the pilot, relying on his rough estimation, said yes. The ATC granted permission to descend to 11,500 feet. As the pilot began lowering the plane's altitude, they were shocked to see that they were still in the Andes. Suddenly, alarms went off and warning lights flashed in the cockpit. No one understood what was happening. Some rugby players on board joked about the turbulence, trying to make light of the situation. But then, one passenger looked out the window and saw that the clouds were starting to clear, and realized that a mountain was very close. As soon as the plane emerged from the clouds, the pilot saw a massive rock directly in front of them. Panicking, the pilot tried to pull the plane up, but it was too late. The tail of the plane struck the mountain and broke off, sending passengers and debris flying into the air. 3 passengers were killed instantly as they were ejected from the plane. The right wing also broke off, causing the plane to lose balance, and then the left wing hit another mountain and was torn off. Now, only the front part of the plane remained, sliding down a glacier at 350 kilometers per hour. After sliding for 700 meters, the plane finally came to a stop with a final impact. The crash left the plane in ruins, and 12 people, including 2 pilots, died instantly. The plane lay shattered on an unknown mountain in the Andes at an altitude of 3,570 meters. Out of the 45 passengers, 33 were still alive, though most were severely injured and unaware of their location. The plane had strayed 80 kilometers off its intended course, leaving them isolated and desperate for help. What happened next was only a small preview of the horror that was to come. The survivors had no idea what lay ahead, but the barren Andes were about to unleash even more terror upon them. After the crash, 2 survivors, 19-year-old Roberto Canessa and 20-year-old Gustavo Zerbino, both medical students, immediately began checking on the others to see who was alive and who was injured. Among the injured was Nando Parado, who had suffered a head injury and slipped into a coma. The sun was about to set, leaving the rescue team with little time to find the survivors before nightfall. The temperature in the Andes drops to -30 degrees at night, making it nearly impossible to survive. The Chilean search and rescue team was notified of the missing plane within an hour, and 4 planes were dispatched to search the Andes. However, they found nothing due to the thick snow and fog, which made it difficult to spot the white plane. Night fell and the rescue operation was suspended. The survivors hoped to make it through the night, believing that someone would come to rescue them the next day. They spent the night inside the wrecked plane, using bags and suitcases to close off the back of the plane to stay warm. But the night was brutal, with temperatures plunging to minor 30 degrees Celsius. 5 people could not endure the cold and died during the night, reducing the number of survivors to 28. On the morning of October 14th, 11 planes from Argentina, Chile, and Uruguay took off to continue the search. Unfortunately, the white plane was still invisible against the snowy mountains. The rescue planes flew directly overhead, but the survivors were not noticed. In a desperate attempt to signal the rescue team, the survivors used lipstick to write SOS on the plane's roof, but the lipstick ran out. They then used their suitcases to make a large cross in the snow, hoping it would be visible from the air. 3 planes flew overhead that day, but none saw them, and the day passed without rescue. On October 15th, the same thing happened again. The survivors realized they were in serious trouble and began using items from the plane to devise survival techniques. They melted snow in the sunlight to collect drops of water, but had very little food left. On the 3rd day after the crash, October 16th, Nando Parado woke up from his coma, only to learn that his mother had died in the crash and his 19-year-old sister was severely injured. Days passed, but no help arrived. The plane's food supply ran out, and the survivors were exposed to the sun's harsh rays, which reflected off the snow and damaged their eyes. They had now been stranded on the mountain for 8 days, enduring extreme hunger, thirst, and cold. Search planes continued to fly overhead but did not spot them. On the 8th day after the crash, Nando Parado's sister succumbed to her injuries and died. Meanwhile, the search operation was called off after 8 days due to the heavy snowfall in the Andes during October. The authorities believed that by now, all the passengers were dead, and decided to wait 2 months before resuming the search to recover the bodies. The survivors, using a radio they found in the wreckage, heard the news that the search for Flight 571 had been called off. This news shattered their last hope of being rescued. They realized that death was almost certain unless they took matters into their own hands. They began to use the plane's materials to try to stay warm. They cut up the plane seats and stuffed the padding into their clothes to protect against the cold, and wrapped seat covers around their feet to create makeshift shoes. But the biggest challenge was finding food. By the 11th day, all the food had been consumed, and some survivors even tried eating parts of the plane, like the cotton from the seats and leather covers, but this only made them sick. Faced with starvation, the survivors had no choice but to consider the unthinkable, eating the flesh of their deceased friends and family members. This decision was not taken lightly, and it was Roberto Canessa who first tried it. Some others also attempted it but could not stomach the idea. However, as more days passed without any other option, they eventually resorted to cannibalism to stay alive. Day by day, they struggled to survive. They slept inside the wrecked plane to stay warm at night, but on the 16th day after the crash, October 29th, nature dealt them another blow. An avalanche hit the mountain during the night, burying the plane under a thick layer of snow. The avalanche was so powerful that it forced snow into the plane, suffocating 8 more survivors. Now only 19 people remained, trapped under the snow. It took them 3 days to dig themselves out, and they realized that if they stayed there, they would all die one by one. They decided that their only hope was to leave the mountain and seek help. Among the survivors, 3 were relatively uninjured and decided to embark on a journey to find help. They packed some meat for the journey and wore the warmest clothes they could find. On November 15th, 33 days after the crash, the 3 men set out to find help. As night fell, they discovered the wreckage of the plane's tail section, which had broken off during the crash. Inside, they found some food and decided to spend the night there. In the tail section, they found a battery and considered using it to power the plane's communication device and call for help. But the battery weighed 25 kilograms, and it was impossible to carry it back to the main wreckage in their weakened state. They then thought of bringing the communication device to the battery, but their efforts failed because the plane's electrical system operated on 115 volts AC, while the battery provided only 24 volts DC. Despite their best efforts, they were unable to get the radio working. On December 11, 1972, 59 days after the crash, another avalanche struck, killing 3 more survivors. Only 16 people remained alive. Now, Parado and Vizintin set out to climb a glacier without any mountain gear. They head west, unaware if they'll find any human settlement in that direction. They only knew they had to cross the mountain ahead, hoping to find help, and expected to do so within 3 days. Therefore, they only carried enough meat supplies for 3 days. They stitched a sleeping bag together and climbed the mountain all day without any gear. At night, the 3 of them huddled together in one sleeping bag, enduring -30 degrees Celsius in the open, which was no easy feat. By the morning of the 4th day, they had reached the top of the mountain. But upon reaching the summit, they were shocked to realize they had been traveling in the wrong direction all along. The path ahead led to a dead end. Since they had very little food left, they decided that one of them would return to the crash site while the other 2 would continue forward. As a result, Vizintin turned back, while Parado and Nessa continued on. After climbing to the mountain's peak, they managed to find the correct path and kept moving forward for several more days. Eventually, they found a small stream and followed it downstream. After walking for 9 more days, on December 20th, they spotted 3 people on the other side of the river. Exhausted, having trekked 61 kilometers in the mountains over the last 9 days, they called out for help, but the people responded with tomorrow and left. They received no help that day. However, the next day, one of the villagers returned and threw a pen and paper wrapped in a stone across the river. Parado and Nisa picked it up and wrote everything that had happened. Parado wrote in Spanish, "I am from a plane that fell in the mountains. I came from Uruguay. We have been walking for 10 days. My injured friend is at the plane crash site. We urgently need help, but we don't know how to get it. We have no food. We are weak and have no strength left to walk. Please save us." The villager read the note and understood everything. He knew a plane had crashed in the mountains some time ago, and people had searched the area, but he was amazed that these people were still alive. The villager quickly went to the city and shared the information with the army command. Soon, the Chilean Air Force arrived to rescue them. Army officers took Parado and Nessa by helicopter to the crash site, and on December 22, 1972, 70 days after the crash, the remaining survivors were rescued. The survivors were in very poor condition, and only 16 out of everyone on the plane managed to survive. This heartbreaking story is truly unbelievable and serves as a lesson for the world, a reminder that with determination, patience, and humanity, anything is possible. If you like this story, please like the video and subscribe to the channel. That's it for today's video. See you in the next one.